Thank you, Alice, and thank you for being here. We needed some extra help this morning, and Alice is here with us, and I really, really appreciate you. You're helping us out, and that was a wonderful song. Fits right in. As I said I don't know if you read in the online email newsletter a little bit about my sermon this morning, but one of the things about printing some kind of advertisement about what you're going to preach about is you don't want it to sound too boring because you want people to come. So you kind of maybe beef it up a little bit and make it sound like, and who knows what eventually comes out because you submit these things 2 and 3 weeks in advance. But I think I'm still pretty much on target. In that advertisement, I said I felt as though, and I'm not the only one, that's for sure. I felt as though many people, including myself, have begun to characterize the space that the nation fills right now is in a very negative one. There's been a lot of talk, especially in the last 5-10 years, about a lack of civility that's taking place in the body politic, as well as in a lot of our communities, and just what is going on. And then you always hear these people, this isn't what America is supposed to be about. And the key words there is supposed to be, because certainly we have a history of incivility in this nation amongst each other and towards others. So there's that balance, that tension between how we think of ourselves, what we aspire to, and then what we actually are. And there are those like David Brooks, who is one of the political pundits that many people read, and whether you like David Brooks or not, he is asked, why have Americans become so mean? Why are we so sad? Why are we so angry on this 50th anniversary of Watergate? Does that have anything to do with it? Why are we so angry? Some have even gone further, and in this era have characterized what's going on right now as an era of Schadenfreude. If I could have the second, I don't know if you're familiar with Schadenfreude, this cartoon out of the New Yorker. Schadenfreude is pleasure derived from another person's misfortune. So what you've got here is a person here driving with nobody in the lanes at all, and the sign says Schadenfreude next 25 miles, while everybody else is experiencing the pain, the agony of, and there maybe have been moments like that when you kind of are tooling up 95 and you see the traffic jam on the other side of the road and go, wonderful, my luck. I'm really enjoying it. So do we live in an era characterized by Schadenfreude? Please take that word with you this morning if you're not familiar with it. Schadenfreude. Good, Schadenfreude. Consequently, in spite of the historical injustices that we may recognize and that are part of our new Article 2 in our bylaws as Unitarian Universalists, and part of our bylaws and rules that state that we're going to address the historical injustices, not just of our nation, but of us as an association. In spite of these historical injustices, maybe it's that anger, that sadness, that meanness, that Schadenfreude that has maybe led into an unwillingness to want to support any action in addressing some of those injustices like slavery, injustices like Jim Crow, injustices like the genocide of indigenous people in the United States, injustices like the schools that were created and then people were abused, of which Unitarian Universalists were part of, since we were given a school in Colorado in the 1850s to oversee the Ute Indians that were eventually moved to Utah. I'd totally forgotten about that until I was reading a New Yorker article that was naming the different faith communities that participated in these atrocities, and lo and behold, there were the Unitarians. There's an unwillingness, a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of drive to address these injustices, and we see them in school boards. We see them in entire states that wish to revise their history textbooks, that want to deny talking about that these things actually happened. Some don't even want to admit that there's anything to repair. Let's just pretend it didn't happen. That's their attitude, or at least that's what seems to happen. So let me circle back and say something a little bit more about Wilkerson's metaphor, which I think is a great one. That she sees our nation almost like an old house. This is an extreme version of an old house. Who knows how old this house is, but I don't think there's any doubt that it needs some repair. And some will say, not my problem. Well, whoever owns this house has got a lot of problems. But some will say, not my problem. It didn't happen under my watch. It's up to somebody else to repair it. Ever try to sell your home like that? It's a challenge. So let me tell you a personal story. I live in a house that's as old as I am, 75 years old, and we purchased it as the only house we've ever lived in Annapolis. Not to say we haven't tried to move, but we purchased it 40 years ago. Over 40 years ago, we've lived in the same house and have made some repairs, some remodeling. And ever since we bought the house, there was a window and a back door that never quite closed right. And I always attributed it to Maryland humidity, right? Blame the humidity for everything. The way you feel, your joints, as well as windows and doors that don't close because they swell up with all the moisture in the air, right? So then about 20 years ago, after a lot of severe flooding in our crawl space, I decided it's time to do something about it. And so we got some estimates. And I'll never forget the day one of the estimators was downstairs, and I hear this, Mr. Muir, could you come here? Well, I've got bad knees, but he was telling me to come in. The only way into our crawl space is to crawl, appropriately named. So I crawl in, and he says, I'm back in the corner. And I go back in the corner, and he says, let me show you something. And he shows me where the roots from the tree just outside have grown underneath the foundation, have grown through the foundation, and have displaced the cinder blocks that form the foundation by anywhere from 4 to 6 inches. We're talking about one whole corner of the house. And he said, I think this needs to be repaired. And I said, and if we don't? And he goes, well, he says, imagine Thanksgiving or Christmas when everybody is gathered around the table and suddenly you begin to see dishes slide in one direction. And he goes, that may be extreme, but that's what we're talking about. Your house is going to begin to sink on this corner of the house. My daughter, who's just recently been trying to buy a new home in Brooklyn, New York, called a couple of days ago, and she said, remember when we had the house repaired? And I said, yeah. She goes, well, there's one corner of our living room that sinks a little bit. Should I have somebody look at that? And I said, yeah, you probably should before you buy the house. That's probably a good idea. To make a long story short, they came on a weekend when I chose not to be there because what they had to do was remove the tree, of course. Then they had to jack up that corner of the house, take out the cinder blocks and foundation, build a new foundation, and then put the house back down again. And guess what happened? The back door closed. The window closed. It wasn't the humidity at all. It's that the whole house was warped. At least that portion of the house was warped. And thank goodness I hadn't taken more drastic action because that's what it was, in addition to a whole bunch of other things. Why should we care about the past mistakes and harms and injustices? Because they need to be repaired. Because things aren't right. Things won't work right until we address the repairs that need to be made. And we can ignore them at our own expense, like at a house imploding, a roof falling in, because we want to make things right. Of course, we can let our house remain broken, in need of repair, and continue to live in it. But for some of us, it just gnaws at us. Just gnaws at us. Or we can admit that something needs repairing. And this can be hard. Because even then, we lived in the house for 20 years, and I kept thinking, oh, it's just the Maryland humidity, as though it was going to fix itself. Resistance is common, it's expected, it can be challenging. So let me share another example that has been really close to me for over a decade now. You know, I have talked too much, and thank you, Jane, for sharing a piece of my manuscript, but I have been studying the relationship between Unitarian Universalism and colonization, it's called the era of colonization, 1898 to 1946, of when the United States felt like it needed to join the big boys of the world and start to colonize. You know, you had England that was colonizing all over the world. You had, you know, virtually every European nation had colonies. We had none other than the West. We had basically colonized the West and indigenous people. So what do we decide to do? We decided to colonize Hawaii in 1893. And just by the way, the ambassador to Hawaii who led the revolution against the monarchy was a Universalist minister. And then in 1898, with the Spanish-American War, we colonized the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam. And poor Puerto Rico still lives with that. And in a way, the Philippines still lives with that, the neocolonialism that was started by the United States. And of course, Americans just, you know, I was kind of like, I have to admit, I was kind of like McKinley after I started studying the Philippines, and after the Spanish-American War, with the war in Manila, McKinley had to go back to his map room and have somebody show him where the Philippines were. And the first time I went, I wasn't really sure where the Philippines was. I knew it was a country, but I didn't know that much about it. It was our colony. Filipinos know a lot about the United States. The United States knows virtually nothing about the Philippines. Even though we have exported basically the United States Western ways onto the culture of the Philippines. They didn't ask for it. We basically said, this is the way you're going to be. And what I've been exploring is how the leadership, Unitarian Universalist leadership during that period of the era of colonization, how the values and principles of the religious faith of those Unitarian and Universalist colonizers helped to shape the colonization of the Philippines, the culture of the Philippines as it is known today. The politics, the educational system, the financial system, right down the line. Most Filipinos don't know that it was Unitarian Universalists who were involved. They just know it was the United States, and there still is a grudge if you can get past the respect that most Filipinos have for Americans. But once you gain their trust and you begin to talk about Western-Eastern relationships, it begins to come up pretty quickly. I'm interested in what were those values and principles that shaped the Philippines. What's more, are those values and principles still shaping us as Unitarian Universalists? Which is to say, do we still live as Unitarian Universalists today with neo-colonial principles that are shaping who we are and our faith and the way we run things? To give you a quick summary, yes, we still do. And because of that, I have been asked, because of my research and because of talking about this so much, do we owe the nation of the Philippines as Unitarian Universalists, as a nation, do we owe them an apology? I see a few heads nodding. I would like you to tell me what that apology looks like, because I have no idea. You have an idea?
Yeah, it's not now.
Say it again. Oh, yeah. Jane's story this morning?
Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect. And Jaden and I really did not talk about this, so the fact that this is an Hawaiian word is beautiful, because there have been people apologize. In fact, it was under Clinton's administration that we did apologize to the Hawaiian people. And the Congregational Church has apologized because so many of the missionaries that this Universalist minister, the grandchildren, the generations of children who were now wealthy landowners, were all the sons and daughters and generations of Congregational missionaries. The Congregational Church has apologized to Hawaii. But as I'm going to talk a little bit more about, an apology is one thing. Doing something after your apology is something quite different, which is why I've titled the sermon Post-Apology. Because what follows after you say, I'm sorry, or I apologize that happened? And again, this assumes that we're willing to recognize that any of this took place and that we have some responsibility. The purpose of an apology, this is a version of what Jane was talking about. The purpose of an apology is not necessarily to seek forgiveness. I mean, we have no control over whether or not somebody wants to forgive us. It would be nice if somebody would forgive us, but when we apologize, we shouldn't necessarily expect forgiveness, and if somebody does forgiveness, that then makes it okay. Everything is okay. We go back to base one and start all over again. The purpose of apology is to create agency, to create action, to create the opportunity for something to happen, like putting in the new foundation of your home and jacking it up so the house doesn't implode. It's taking action. Moving forward with apology has to be thoughtful and planned. And right now, I'm wondering if in this apology to the Philippines, if Unitarian Universalists have the ingredients, the faith ingredients, the spiritual, theological stamina to shape an apology. I think with our new Article 2 that talks about centering love, which surprisingly, in both Unitarianism and in Universalism, there is no corporate statement, associational statement, that has ever mentioned love. Can you believe that? They'll talk about the love of God, the love of Jesus, but there is nothing that says love is important to us, love is the center of who we are, until this past June. And you know what? There were people who didn't want to do it. As well as using that centered love to address historical injustices. Again, I'm not quite sure what this is going to look like, but I sure think we ought to try to shape something. Now, I know this is all at kind of a macro level. You know, it's hard to get your head around this. This is not necessarily what people come to church to hear about. You know, it's kind of like people don't join the United States or choose to be a citizen of the United States to hear about all their horrible pasts. You know, you don't come to church to hear about, you know, how we need to rectify neo-colonialism. I wouldn't. That's not, you know, but it's there, right? It's there. So let me take it from this macro level to a more micro level. Speaking of macro, fewer than 10 years ago, I was in Glacier Bay National Park in the Inside Passage of Alaska. Anybody here take an Alaskan cruise before? I'm sure there have. This is a big touring community. Right, so, you know, we were in the Glacier Bay National Park, and where the average age of these glaciers is 7,000 years old. It's pretty awesome to see this. In fact, I was joking with my family who was with me that after a point, after seeing one glacier after another, you kind of go, oh, there's another glacier, you know, oh, there's another orca, or, you know, it's just like, my son-in-law said, bald egos in Alaska are like pigeons in Annapolis. You know, they're everywhere. You know, they're just everywhere. About every month I can see maybe a bald eagle in my community. you know, within 3 hours, I probably saw 24 bald eagles in an area called Eagle Bay in the Juneau area. I mean, it's just magical, as are these glaciers, but they're macro. So last week I was standing on the railing of this cruise ship as we made our way up the inland passage into Glacier Bay National Park. And I was looking at these glaciers, and I just said kind of out loud, this is awesome. This is awesome. And there was a person standing next to me who said, it certainly is. And I turned to look, and it was a woman, about my age, roughly. And she spoke with a very, very thick accent. I identified it as German, having had a mother-in-law who was German and having heard her speak quite often. I identified her accent as German. Now, I'm going to summarize our conversation, but you need to know that this is a conversation where actually very little was said, but it took place over a period of about 25 minutes, which means there were long periods of silence between what we said. I'm going to become emotional, and I think you'll see why. So I must have said to her something like, I detect an accent. Where are you from? I didn't say that, but what she said to me was, if I tell you where I'm from, you'll be disappointed. And I said, tell me more. And she said, I'm from Israel. And so we talked a little bit about what that means, about the challenges, the fact that I'd never been to Israel, and I would like to have gone, but it's never been a high priority. You would think as a minister, I need to get to Israel. No, I haven't been to Israel, and one day I may go. And so there's these long periods of silence. And she said, I'm really hoping to return after this trip with my husband. And I thought, it's your home, why wouldn't you return? And then she said, the airport has been closed. The borders have been closed. My children are there. My daughter is in the Israeli Defense Forces. And we're not allowed to go home. And I don't know what we're going to do. Meanwhile, these 7,000-year-old glaciers are the background. And I just said to her, I am so sorry. And I kind of looked the way I look right now, and this is the way I sounded. And she had tears in her eyes. And she said, there's nothing you can do. And I said, I know, I'm just so sorry. And there was another long pause. And she said, are you here with your family? And I said, yes, I'm here with my son and my daughter and their family. And then she said, and your wife? And I said, my wife recently died. And so she's not here, but she really wanted to be. And so we're on this trip in her honor. And she said, I am so sorry. At which point, we are both standing there against these 7,000-year-old glaciers, sobbing, and then hugging. And I think we both kind of caught ourselves thinking, whoa, what's going on here? And we both kind of turned and looked at the glaciers. And I turned to say something to her, and she wasn't there. I have no idea what her name was. She didn't tell me any more about her situation. So what's my point? An authentic apology, the language of apology, is the language of recognition, of acknowledgement, of affirmation. It's a way of saying to the other person, I see you, I hear you, perhaps even I can feel for you. Not necessarily I understand. It's not an opportunity to say, oh yes, the same thing has happened to me. An authentic apology with integrity becomes a place to start. It can empower us. What comes next is totally up to you. How you choose to fill in the space after you've put a stake in the ground with that apology is up to you. But an apology is needed. If I could have the final slide. Mary Gordon, maybe you're familiar with her, she's a novelist, and she has said, there is probably nothing worse than an apology that doesn't apologize. I cannot help but feel we've all had that experience. The person who says, I'm so sorry you feel that way. What on earth does that mean? Or the person who says before their apology, now I don't mean to offend. Or with all due respect, because you know the next words are going to offend and the next words are going to be disrespectful. Those are not apologies. Apology has to show some integrity. It needs to be thoughtful. It needs to show a change. It needs to show the desire for repair. So I leave you with the question. How will you fill the post-apology space? How will you choose to act? How will you show integrity and authenticity after you say, I am so sorry? Blessings on us all. Amen.